If you can grab a Bible and open it to Mark chapter 5, that'd be great. I told you 2 weeks ago when we last met that I felt like the Lord really gave me focus as my word for the year. And in particular, as it relates to Sycamore, just getting back to the basics. What are we fundamentally about? We're fundamentally about being people that live in the grace of God that's found in Jesus Christ, and then live out his mission to make disciples, right? I know the Bible language, we'll unpack that a little bit later, but fundamentally what we want to be about is following Jesus, learning how to live life like he lived it, and then looking for people who might follow us and teach them how to do the same. And so from the front here, what I want to do is give you some tools that you can take that next step in this particular area of gospel story that we're going to focus on for the next 2 weeks. This is in Yellowstone National Park, the way that, the sulfates and all the other things that are underground that leak into the water. There's all these, rivulets or whatever that word is, and pools of water that are around. What's the big geyser called? I should know this. Old Faithful, thank you. All around this place, there's these incredibly just, beautiful patterns that are created because of what's happening above and below the surface. This is when I was skiing in the Alps, and the skiers in the foreground might serve as a little bit of an optical illusion, but that speck right there is the top of the ski lift, right? Where the big thing is that lets you off and everything else. The scale of these mountains, I've been out west and I've skied, right? These just put those to shame, the scale of it, right? You're up so high that it's just like the whole thing looks like just one big ski run because there are no trees. So there's no differentiation between where the path is and where the woods are because trees can't exist, right? So it's just happened to be where they groom the snow versus where they don't groom the snow, right? But the scale of the Alps is unbelievable. This is my home state of Pennsylvania from a satellite image, and this is you see the geography of the state. The state's really interesting because you've got the coastal plain, the Piedmont, the Ridge and Valley region, the Allegheny Plateau, right? And then you've got a Great Lake. So basically everything from this line west drains to the Mississippi. Everything from this line east drains to the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, right? The landform, what is my point here? The landform, the landscape of the world around us tells the story of the earth, right? And then we have this great privilege as human beings, like whether it's in Florence along the Arno River or whether it's in New York City along the High Line, to interact, to create our own landscape, right? That reveals how we use the raw materials of the earth to cultivate society and to grow our civilization, right? So my point is that when you look all around the world around you, you're given clues about the story of the earth, right? And the story of humans' interaction with the earth. 2 weeks ago, we introduced this tool, the landscape of life, right? And part of what I wanted you to see was that, one of the realities of the scriptures is that God's omnipresent. He's always there. He's the red, right? That's part of the drawing up front. And whether it's the eruptions of life, the earthquakes, the erosions of life, he's always there. But sometimes, because we're not focused on him, it takes those explosive moments, right? Or it takes the moments when the ground of our lives shifts out from underneath us, right? What was I? I was a junior in college. Was I a junior in college? Let's say I was a junior in college. I was a junior in college. And it was 10 months after I was in a car accident, pretty horrific car accident, right? And I just remember, I think it was a Saturday morning, morning for college students. It had to be like 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, I can't remember. But I get this call from my mom, right? And you know how the people that you know really well, the people that you love, the tonality of their voice, immediately you can see their face, immediately you can tell what they're thinking, and the way that she said, "Hi, Nathan," and the way that her voice cracked a little bit, I knew something was wrong, right? And one of my best friends from growing up, who I had moved into my school district in the third grade, and he was in my third grade class, right? And we had graduated together. So one of my best friends was out with his friends, hanging out, meant to spend the night, couldn't sleep, had to work the next day, got up, drove home, took a turn too fast, and that was it, right? And so she was calling to tell me that he had died the night before, right? These earthquake moments of your life that you could never predict, right? But in that, somehow, God reveals his presence, right? Like when I had interactions with my high school friends who weren't believers, right? And who had no way of understanding or processing what had just happened to us, right? There were moments in which I felt, after I cried my eyes out for 3 days, there were moments where the peace and the calm of God was like tangible. You know, I could touch it, right, in my life. Those erosive moments that usually tend to be longer, right? The stripping away of your pride, the stripping away of your ability, the stripping away of your comfort, your security, whatever it is. And then in the end of that process, God reveals himself. You find God through that process, right? And so I wanted you to see that God is omnipresent, that there have been these moments of your life, this landscape of this life, this story of your life where God has shown himself to you. And my point a couple weeks ago, remember that scripture that I talked about from Paul, running to win, right? We don't just run a race to like, hey, isn't this fun? Like, second place doesn't get a prize, right? There's only one race that we're in as Christians, and that's to be in relationship with God as a follower of Jesus. And the prize is being in relationship with God as a follower of Jesus forever, right? We should not mistake ourselves that heaven's going to be anything else aside from being in a full relationship with God and all the benefits that go along with that. So Paul's saying, eternity starts right now. So are you running to win that race, running to win him as a prize, right? Are you running to be close with him right now? And I said that excavation is kind of the one, you know, this isn't like, what do I say? This isn't, I'm sure there's other landforms to our landscape of life, right? This is a helpful tool for understanding our landscape of life. Of these four, excavation is the one that we control, right? You can choose to dig a well down to God's presence through regular Bible study, right? Through praying regularly with him, with other people, through listening to worship music, to singing out to him, to going into creation and realizing how big he is and how small you are, right? There are intentional disciplines, rhythms, and patterns in which we can have regular access to the God of the universe, right? Over there on those sheets, those are the all the daily readings that we had on our website last year, right? So 6 times 52, whatever that math is. And many of those I wrote commentaries to. So if you're a person who's new to reading the scriptures, you don't know how to navigate them, or you want something to just kind of provoke your thinking, at the end of the day, the 3 fundamental questions you can ask every time you read the scriptures is, God, what are you grabbing my attention with? Based on how I answer that question, what are you saying to me? And then based on how I answer that, what do you want me to do about it, right? How are you grabbing my attention? What are you saying to me? What do you want me to do about it, right? And so you can always just use those 3 questions as your guide. But if you need a little bit more, if you want a little bit more background, I wrote commentaries to over half of those probably, right? And so you have all of last year, and now you have, what's today, the 19th? You have 19 minus the Sundays, right? I give you Sundays off, of scripture all throughout this year, right? We've been going through the Gospel of Luke, right? And so that's a way that you can excavate. Every Thursday morning, we've done away with power hour. We don't know what to call it yet, but it's prayer for 30 minutes, right? We're trying to lessen the threshold a little bit. I still get it that it's 6:30 in the morning. I just don't know how with your schedules and my schedules that evenings or weekends make it any easier. So if you want prayer for yourself, there's yellow cards in the tub. If you want to show up and just listen and learn how to pray, it's a great opportunity to do that, right? These are some things that we're offering to you so that you can excavate. Does that make sense? So just how we look at the world, just how we look at maps, it gives us a revelation of the story of the earth. We can look at the landscape of our lives to understand our stories a little bit. Have you done that in the past 2 weeks? Did you use this tool at all to think of, gosh, what was one moment in which God's presence was explosive? It was an eruption, right? I know you've had all those, right? But sometimes what the enemy does is he distracts us, right, from being intentional, from being focused on God. And so then we miss out on what the Lord has for us. So let's not do that. So Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. If somebody could read that aloud, I would be grateful.
They went across the lake to the region of the
Let's say it's Gerasenes.
Gerasenes. Thank you. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. One of the things that I've learned over the past couple of years is how to read scripture immersively, and I can't do that, teach you that right now because of time, but when you're reading the scriptures, I encourage you to take on the personality of one of the characters in the story, particularly these narrative accounts with Jesus, and try to live out, experience the story through their eyes, particularly through the five senses, right? And so when you read the end of chapter 4, we actually learn that this whole thing is happening at night, right? So we got this crazy guy who screams to himself all the time. He's violent and out of control, like breaking chain. Okay, we just read that. Like, oh, he broke chain. Like, no, you're chained with iron and you're cutting yourself with stones, and you're living in a graveyard. I mean, this account is incredibly dark and dramatic at the beginning, right? And somehow this guy or the spirits in this guy, whatever it is, see Jesus from a long way off, right? And they're like, what's going to happen now, right? So if you're a disciple, like that's how I tend to read, right? Because I like to see myself as a follower of Jesus. So what if I were following Jesus in this circumstance? I'm absolutely freaked out, right? And I have to say, I have to pause here for a second because I see a bunch of skeptics in the room. It's like, I know we're in modern Western culture, so anytime you talk about demon possession or impure spirits, it's like, okay, that's the stuff of Hollywood and make-believe, right? That's fine for Harry Potter, Nate, but it's not good for me, right? It's like, okay, well, let's think for a second. What actually characterizes this possessed man, right? I don't know if I can see it. Is it what these words say are lonely? We see that in verses 2 and 3. Enslaved on the inside, verses 2 through 7. Violent and out of control on the outside, verses 3 and 4. And self-destructive, verse 5, right? Have you ever seen somebody who is struggling with drug addiction? I haven't seen many. When I did some volunteer work in Baltimore, we were trying to set up this community-based HIV testing station at this local church in a black neighborhood that had a breakfast every Saturday morning, right? And I remember being in there one time, and this lady, I don't know much about heroin, right? But the one or two people that I've seen that are on it and are strung out,
it's just like this, like slow, like just drool coming from the mouth, right? It's like just completely like standing, they're alive, they're still human, but man, they're far from it, right? And that was the first time that I ever seen it in the flesh, right, in person. So she comes into this breakfast just like super slow. She's sitting at this table, and then they do the lean and they like nod off, right? And I'm like freaking out inside. I'm like, does anybody see what's happening here, right? And everybody else is like, you can't do anything. Like, she's fine. She'll get out. Like, you cannot help her right now, right? She is incapacitated, but the only thing you can do is wait until she comes off that high, right? Another time our small group, once a month, we helped out at this place that was like a rehabilitation center for veterans who were dealing with some sort of substance abuse, right? And after we went for a number of months, I started to engage this one guy that was friendly to me. Started to hear more about his story, and for him it was crack cocaine, right? And he told me one time, he said, nothing else in life did it for me like that. It's like not money, not acclaim, not having stuff, not relationships, not getting drunk, not sex, nothing. Nothing could take me as high as that, right? And so we see, I'm not getting down on people who deal with substance abuse, right? But what fundamentally happens with them? They become enslaved to this thing, right? This urge, this impulse, this experience, this inner feeling, right? Or this physical feeling of life, right? Has taken them to another place, and now they are a slave to going back and getting that experience, right? And it might be easy to look down on a person like that, or to say, oh, well, that's why you never get started, right? It was your fault to take the, okay, whatever. But I wonder if in the same, in a parallel sort of way, any of us are enslaved to anything. Like I wonder if you just think about it for a second. Some of you, maybe it's attention, or acclamation, right, or respect. It's like if people don't notice what you're doing, in particular the things that you're doing well, you feel dissed, right? You feel missed, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, how can I, manipulate this conversation to just recognize some of the things that I've done, or manipulate this relationship, or change my posture in the meeting a little bit, so that I can be seen for who I really am and what I've been accomplished or what I've accomplished, right? Some of you, I know, I won't mention any names because I love you, are addicted to safety, right? It's like you just want everything, especially for your kids, to be safe, right? I don't want anybody to get hurt because I love my kids, but then it breeds this incredible anxiety because you try to achieve the safety through control. You realize you can't control anything, so then that breeds this anxiety, and then all of a sudden you're sending your kids to school with bulletproof vests and bubble wrap. It's like, well, you can never be too sure. You know what I'm saying? I mean, honestly, it's a joke, but it's like some of us are so irrational about safety. The things that we do, right? The lengths that we go to ensure safety and security for ourselves and our family. It really is irrational. We're possessed by it. We need it, right? And then there's some people like me, right, who are addicted to doing stuff, right? Hard for people like me to just be. Particularly, I got to do productive things, right? I have to be successful. I have to be able to cross something off a list, right? And it can become possessive, where it's like, man, I'm not even myself in front of these people because I'm so consumed with what the next thing is, right? So let's not look down on the people that struggle with heroin and crack, and let's realize that every one of us, in some form or fashion, can become possessed, can become so consumed and addicted to something that it controls us, right? And so even though this story is dramatic, even though the story is about demon possession, and we feel like we might not be able to relate, I think each of us can relate to this idea of not feeling like we're really ourselves, feeling like something inside of us has gone wrong, right? This is where I'm going to introduce our next tool. These words you don't have to worry about so much. We're going to talk about 4 B's today, okay? We step into this story with this man who's possessed by an impure spirit, and we see the brokenness of his life, right? The people that I told you about based on my personal experiences, even my own life, I've experienced brokenness, right? It's fair to say that whether or not you're a Christian, actually just if you're a human being, you get this sense that things aren't exactly the way that they're supposed to be, right? That life doesn't exactly add up in every single way. And my question is, where does that come from, right? We can look at a person who's yelling at the top of their lungs, who's out of their mind, who's cutting themselves with stones, and we can say, that's not right. But as C.S. Lewis would say, how do you know what a curved line is or a squiggle line is if you don't know what a straight line is, right? I think each one of us, in our heart of hearts, we know what wholeness is, right? Or to say it another way, we know what beauty is. We know that with beauty comes no pain, no problems, no punishment, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other P's, but 3's enough, right? And God agrees with us, right? In the beginning, Adam and Eve took walks with God in the cool of the day, and they were naked and unashamed. Something that would be very difficult / impossible for me to say. I don't know about you guys, right? No shame, no guilt. I know God holy, He knows me holy. All is good. Life is full, right? So the question becomes, how did we go from beauty to brokenness? What got us into our present situation, right? And the hard truth of the scriptures, and the hard truth that I'll give you this morning, is that this move was up to us. Originally it was up to Adam and Eve, so we can blame them first. But sadly, as a preacher once said that I've always remembered, is it may not be as important that the garden, the Genesis account was true, but what's more important is that it is true. Every day there are things in my life where God says, I want to give you full and lasting life. You can have all this stuff, just stay away from this one little thing over here. And I say, no thanks, and I go and take this. I do life my own way, right? That's what sin is, right? It's just imperfection under God's law. It's missing the target that is living in relationship with God. It's not being obedient to the way that He's created us, right? And so we've created it. Sadly, what we did was we brought sin into the world, right? And what that means for us is death. The brokenness of our day-to-day life that we see in broken relationships, in physical brokenness, right? It's not just that our relationship with God is broken, but actually all of creation to some degree is broken, right? This demoniac didn't say, hey, come on, impure spirit, come into me, right? But what sin does is it taints, it breaks all of creation, right? It changes the spiritual dynamics of the world, right? And so now we're susceptible to attacks from the enemy. We're susceptible to the sin of other people, right? The creation itself actually doesn't work the way that it was supposed to work, right? And all those things are just a foretaste of what we'll ultimately experience without a relationship with God, and that's death. Our physical death and then our spiritual death, which is disconnection from Him. But there's hope, right? What happens with this guy when the people come and they see him dressed and in his right mind? Nobody, despite their efforts to control him, right, to bring him back from the dark side, to make him whole again, nobody had any effect to be able to do that, right? But he has this interaction with Jesus. The power of God is released through Jesus. and his life is completely changed, right? It's hard to see a more stark contrast between yelling in the dark with bloody arms and body because you've been cutting yourself with stones, to dressed in pure white clothes in your right mind, sitting at the feet of Jesus. That's a big contrast. The invitation of Jesus, the invitation of the gospel, the invitation of Christianity is not to become a nice person. It's to become a completely new person, right? Jesus said to somebody in John 3, you can look it up if you don't believe me, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, in other words, if you want God to be in his rightful place in your life, then you must be born again. You must become something completely new from who you are right now, right? So the invitation that Jesus gives us, that God gives us through Jesus, however you want to word it, is birth. Without God intervening, right, if we're left in brokenness forever, we have no future. I mean, we have a future, but how could my friend, 20 years old, almost 21 years, how could he know that he was going to take that turn too fast and that was it, right? How can you know how long your life's going to be? So you get some life. How fast is that going to go for you? Like, even if it's 80 years old, I promise you when you get to 80, it's going to feel like it went like this, right? And then ultimately, with spiritual death, there's no future worth living for there either, right? So the reason why I follow Jesus isn't just to become a nice guy. It's because he's given me a completely new life. For this guy, it's like, man, you'd be dumb not to say that this was the greatest thing that had ever happened to him, right? Because he was completely lost, he was completely possessed, he was completely consumed by this impure spirit inside of him. He was completely strung out, right? So whatever your thing is that possesses you, whatever your thing is that you're addicted to, whatever thing it is for you, you ever been in that situation where it's like, wow, I can't believe I said that. Wow, I can't believe I did that. I know myself, and yet I did that to my kid, right? Any parent ever been there, right? It's like, man, if it were just up to me, this is where I'd be, but this is what I get now because of Jesus, because of grace, right? So what's my response to that? Well, what's the response of the guy in the text? I can relate to this guy a lot because when Jesus changed my life, it's like I really did just want to be with him all the time. I know it's weird. So here's one of the weird mysteries of Christianity. Jesus is alive right now somewhere in the universe, right? I don't fully get it. Like I said, it's a mystery. He's a person somewhere, or else the Bible's not right or true, right? But I haven't actually seen Jesus in the flesh. But it's weird that when I get in the scriptures sometimes, when I pray sometimes, when I just sing sometimes to God, it's like he's right there with me, right? It's weird, but it's as real as me standing here before you right now. And I just wanted that when I became a believer, right? When I started following him. I just wanted to be with him because he gave me this freedom, this peace that I couldn't find in relationships, that I couldn't find in achievement, that I couldn't find in all these other things in which I was investing my life, right? And this demon-possessed guy's the same way. He begs Jesus when Jesus gets in the boat, let me go with you, please. Like, I can't imagine life without you, right? What's Jesus' response? He says, go back to your home and tell of the good things that God has done for you. And it's interesting when you read the text, it says he went to all the towns in the Decapolis. The Decapolis was actually a region in northern Palestine up by the Sea of Galilee. Decapolis, 10 cities, right? And so he apparently went to this whole region telling his story. And how does this text end? Mike said, and all the people were amazed. I don't have 3 alliterative words, sorry for you here, but I do have hopefully something that's easy to remember. And that's show and tell. I think we do both. I think the way that we show the world what Jesus has done to us is through our actions and by our words, right? I think we do Night to Shine to show the world who Jesus is and to help them to experience the grace and goodness of God, right? Matthew 5, I think it is, Jesus says, let your light shine before others, right? So they might see your good works or beautiful works and praise your Father in heaven, right? So your life is to be a living example, something that makes other people question why you live the way that you do, right? And ultimately, it's a life that's supposed to point to God. But at the end of the day, we're supposed to use words at some point, right? The message of this whole thing is twofold. The first is that God wants every person. He wants you. He wants every person in your neighborhood, every person in your business, every person at the school you teach at, right? He wants every person in your mom's group to be with him because of his great love, right? But he doesn't just want you, he wants to use you as part of that process when he goes after other people and draws them to himself, right? Of course people have read the Bible and just come to faith, right? I don't know too many people where that's happened. Most people have read the Bible because a friend asked them to, or they went to a church service because a friend asked them to, or they went to Young Life Camp because a friend asked them to. Because a person in the flesh loved them, but then also ultimately said, come with me and let me tell you what this guy's done for me. So I want you to write down these 3 questions. Do I have a gospel story? Do I have a gospel story? Second question, do I know my gospel story? First question, do I have a gospel story? Second question, do I know my gospel story? Third question, do I share my gospel story? Have you actually become new? And if you've become new, do you know it, right? Have you actually gone through the process of identifying, oh, like, this is how God has uniquely shaped me and interacted with me? See this picture that I showed you at the beginning? The interesting thing is that stained glass is beautiful, isn't it? But not in the dark. You ever been in like absolute darkness? How much can you see? Nothing. I'll cut to the answer, right? If you're in absolute darkness, you really cannot see anything, because to see something, you need light shining on it and reflecting off the surface, right? What happens with us when we actually know our gospel stories and share our gospel stories is we start to look like this. They're all different, right? And they need the light of the gospel. They need Jesus Christ shining behind them, illuminating them to actually reveal the picture, right? But when each one of us know our stories and are sharing our stories of what God has done in our lives through Jesus, we start to look like this. And I don't care if you're a Christian or not. Who doesn't like looking at stained glass, right? It's awesome. It's beautiful.